Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we are going to be talking about publicly traded, the PM specifically. This is going to be a relatively short video, but hopefully it will have a bit of new information. I believe that people really don't understand kind of one of the more subtle effects about publicly traded, and this is the main thrust of what we're going to talk about. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about what I think people understand about publicly traded and why publicly traded is good and what the biggest effect of publicly traded is. Okay, if we jump into the livestock ranch, we will see that they are currently owned by aristocrats if they are on privately owned, but on publicly traded, they are split 1/3 capitalists and 2/3 aristocrats. Now, capitalists are a better group to have because they contribute more to the investment pool. They're also industrialist oriented, which is generally better than the landowner oriented aristocrats. They contribute 20% of their dividends, which is this weekly balance, to the investment pool. Aristocrats contribute 10%, and so when you change 1/3 of the ownership over to being capitalist, this will increase the investment pool contribution by roughly 1/6 of what was being contributed before you count for other modifiers. What the perception is for publicly traded on buildings that are already owned by capitalists is that this has no effect because it is the same weekly balance, it's just being split amongst more capitalists. With a couple caveats, with the understanding that, for the example of voting, you know, having more capitalists on like universal suffrage or census suffrage, these types of things, is going to make a big difference because it's going to affect the number of votes, but overall capitalist is not a class that has a lot of people to begin with. And so the idea is, it doesn't really make a difference for any of your already capitalist-owned buildings. And this is incorrect. It has a very small effect that's also very real, and in order to understand it, you need to think about the equilibrium level of employment on buildings and what happens when buildings are not fully employed. On this building for the shipyard, it actually doesn't make a difference whether you're on privately owned or publicly traded. Zero difference whatsoever, as far as I can tell, beyond just, you know, the increased number of employment and the very small effect you have by just having more guys in here because they're splitting the same weekly balance more ways. Where it makes a difference is buildings that are not fully employed. And this difference is particularly small such that I can't really illustrate it in a way that is necessarily easy to view or easy to replicate or this sort of thing. But what will happen is, capitalists, in order to be employed here, need a minimum wage that they are willing to accept. If this minimum wage is not met, they will just fire down, and they will run a negative balance with what they have, and as long as they're running a negative balance, they will continue to fire people. And so the equilibrium employment, when you add 50 capitalists, means the equilibrium employment goes down because you have to pay out all the owners, and because the owners are needed to get a certain minimum wage, and they're not getting anything from dividends, you notice if we hover over here, the capitalists are still getting 28. The building's not making money, it's not making dividends, but the capitalists still have a minimum wage they need. And so what this means is it will make the equilibrium unemployment of buildings that are not fully employed lower. Okay, so, well, why would you want to do this? Or why would you even, like, think about doing this? And what it does is it positively affects buildings that are already profitable. And so what we have, if we decrease the equilibrium unemployment here, and this is going to be a big effect in places that don't have a lot of peasants or don't have a lot of unemployment. We have a little unemployment here. But what will happen is as we decrease the equilibrium unemployment, there is less competition for wages, which can cause wages to drop and the average annual wage to drop. As the average annual wage drops in the buildings that are already profitable, they will get a larger balance. And so what this means is you will be producing less goods because this building will decrease in unemployment, will have fewer armed goods, and you will getting more profits in the hands of the capitalists. When this is good is when the investment pool contribution is a very large effect in the game, which has to do with your overall GDP, because when you have the investment pool, it's going to run eventually into this malus that is multiplied as a function of your GDP size. Now, I don't know exactly what the threshold is when it, like, publicly traded becomes bad or is perhaps not very good, but what you will notice is the buildings that are profitable will be more profitable if you have everything on publicly traded, but the building itself that is creating this difference is not the building. The shipyards, if we have this on privately owned or publicly traded, it's not going to make a difference in the world. And so it's hard to notice this effect because the effect is being created by the buildings that don't have full employment. You will get less employment because they have to pay the capitalists the minimum wage, and these buildings get more profitable. Okay, So I could try and show you, but this is a really small effect, and it won't only be noticeable in large, numbers over large things. And why would you want to do this, or what can you like look into doing things for? We can, for example, we're going to put this on publicly traded. This tooltip lies to us because it says after full employment, which is not necessarily going to be the case. But what you can do is if you want a certain good, if you want to make sure a certain good's employment stays high, what you can do is you can make sure that it is publicly traded instead of, is privately owned instead of publicly traded. So very often the PM for electricity, when you first get it, for example, is not efficient and the buildings will not fully employ. And because you know on fully employed buildings, when you swap to publicly traded, that it will depress the employment or the equilibrium employment of the building, what you can do is on power plants specifically, keep them on privately owned, for example. And what this will do is when the equilibrium employment on buildings, say, an arms industry, is being decreased and is making wages more competitive in other places, it will help the employment of, the buildings that you have selected to be privately owned, because you want to make sure that they have full employment, like the power plants here. And so this will create a small and meaningful effect. I'm not 100% sure if the effect is positive, especially if you have really large unemployment. I think the effect is negative if you have large unemployment because it just creates more unemployment. And it's difficult to evaluate because there's so many moving parts in Victoria 3. And so the main takeaway might not be necessarily something prescriptive here. Although I do think there is something to be taken away here. I think that you take the time to switch the button to swap things to publicly traded, and if there's a good in your market you want to make sure you do not run a shortage of, like, for example, arms industries when the PMs aren't very good, or electricity when the PMs aren't very good, or motor industries when the PMs aren't very good, what you do is you keep them on privately owned, because this will do is it will decrease the equilibrium and unemployment in everywhere else and will make the labor cheaper for all your protected industries that are privately owned. Now, this is kind of something that is, once again, very subtle, and I think it's important to recognize that these subtle things could happen because it's not on the building that's swapping over that's making a difference. It's the other building that's making a difference for the shipyards by making it more, profitable. So if we take a look here and we just decrease this, I really don't think it's going to create a substantive enough effect here, but we're going to swap over here to privately owned. It should make these buildings a little bit more profitable. You notice they get more profitable right off the bat. We might have to wait for a Monday morning. It might not necessarily get the effect we want where these are building become more profitable. We do see the effect we want. We also have all these ports in the queue, right? As soon as these ports finish, the price of steamers is going to go up and the building's profitability here is going to go up. Also, the weekly balance has gone down because it's trying to finish employing all these capitalists. So let's see if we can get the capitalists in time on Sunday morning and see if we can get this balance back in kind of a normal looking thing before any of these finish. I think they're going to finish though. Can we get full employment before then? Perhaps not. You'll see we just barely hit full employment and now the weekly balance is negative. There's of course a few moving parts here. We just finished some more demand for ports, which creates demand for steamers, so this will rebound no matter what. Also, it reached full employment. Generally, when you are not at full employment, your weekly balance will go down as you try and achieve employment. But I think that this is kind of an illustration to some extent of this effect, where by decreasing these, we made these buildings by switching back to privately owned, we made these buildings more profitable in a way that it was very observable immediately. When they become more profitable, the equilibrium employment comes up, or it stops the building from firing as much, which makes it so that this other business in our here is less profitable. Now, the tooling workshop here, this has remained relatively unchanged, so I'm not sure if this is entirely confounding variables or what, but this is kind of an illustration of how to think about how privately owned versus publicly traded affects things, and is perhaps some food for thought. I don't think it's an extremely robust effect. I think the primary effect of publicly traded is in the rural areas, where you get to swap this over to being ownership that is much better than just being aristocrat owned and instead being capitalist owned. This is the primary effect where it's at, but it's not that there is zero effect for all these manufacturing things. Because of equilibrium, unemployment is changed and affected by switching to publicly traded. It makes them fire more people. It takes goods out of the market. It increases unemployment, and it increases profitability of the buildings that are fully employed. I hope this has been informative. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and have a good one.